the ocean, which was really a favorite place for swimming and for fishing, and it's now rather scary. It's terrifying because we see that it's overwashing our shores on a regular basis.
This is the Climate Question podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jordan Dunbar. Small island states are some of the most vulnerable places on Earth to climate change, yet they've produced the least emissions that caused it. Now they're facing an existential threat to their land, to their economies, and to their culture. So this week we're asking, how do we save the world's small islands? With me is someone who knows all about life on a small island and how important it is to try and protect it. Tina Steggy is the climate envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands, a Pacific island chain. Tina, how are you?
Hi, how are you, Jordan? It's nice to be here.
Tina, thanks so much for joining us. Can you paint us a picture of what it was like growing up in the Marshall Islands?
So I grew up on the main atoll, the capital of Majuro. It's in a fairly long atoll. When I say long, it's about 30 miles. So most atoll islands are actually quite small in length. It's short, maybe just a couple miles. But this one was longer. But it's like all other atolls in that it's, I guess you would say, very thin. It's just all coast. So on one side you have the lagoon, and on the other side you have the ocean. So the lagoon is protected and calm and all of those things. And on the other side, the ocean, we're protected by a barrier, by a reef system, but you see the waves crashing not far offshore. So it's really a landscape that is dominated by the blue of ocean, with little bits of green and yellow and white sand. And it was a wonderful place to grow up.
Well, I hear you use the word was. My next question is, how have the Marshall Islands changed in your lifetime?
Well, I think it's still a lovely place for young children, but there's so many difficulties that those children are facing that I didn't face as a young child. One of those is that the ocean, which was really a favorite place for swimming and for fishing, and it's now rather scary. It's terrifying because we see that it's overwashing our shores on a regular basis. That can be from what is called nuisance inundations, where it's just the high tide and salt water is overlapping, to where you have storm systems and very big waves that are crushing seawalls and flooding into homes and forcing people to leave their homes and evacuate to school buildings in the meantime, where our gardens and fields are inundated with salt water, and that means that food is affected, our ability to grow food, not just for that particular time of the inundation, but because it's salt water, months afterwards, where the soil is now salty and you can't regrow. We're also experiencing just changes in weather patterns, which I think is happening across the world. So what we could predict would be times of rain and times of less rain are now much less predictable. It's harder to plan your growing and seasons and how you provide food for your table. So it's just a very different and I think far more threatening environment than it was when I was a young girl.
When you speak to other small island nations, what negative effects are they feeling from climate change?
So much of it is shared, particularly I think the threat of hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons that can devastate a single country. I mean, it can wipe out entire GDP in a single storm. One huge storm can really affect the entire society, not just pockets of it, right? So you lose all your infrastructure, you lose all your electricity, lose all access to water. These are impacts, I think, that are felt across the board, across small island developing states.
Tina, I want to bring in Dr. Rose Marder to talk about how small islands can change or adapt to deal with these changes. Hi, Roseanne.
Hi, Jordan.
So, Roseanne is a senior scientist specialising in adaptation, coastal vulnerability with the NGO Climate Analytics. But this is not just work for you, Roseanne, it's also personal because you grew up in the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. Tell me about St. Lucia.
Oh, well, it is near and dear to my heart. I did grow up there. It's a small island located in the Eastern Caribbean. It's really mountainous, so it's several mountains jutting right out of the sea. We've got the Caribbean Sea on one side, on the west side, and the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. It's a very green, lush island, and we've got lots of lovely beaches, black sand, white sand, and have a strong connection both to the land and to the sea.
Can you tell me about the changes that have been happening in the past decades?
Yes, something that St. Lucia has been experiencing, and this is similar to several islands in the Caribbean and across the world, are the effects of sea level rise. Sea levels have been rising due to climate change. In the Caribbean and in the Pacific, they have been rising faster than the global average. Sea level rise amounts are around 10 to 15 centimeters in those areas. And while those numbers by themselves may not sound very large, that combines with tides and tropical cyclones, which the region also experiences. And that leads to very, very large coastal flooding and damages. This impacts the water supply. Some fresh water is sourced from groundwater, and when that gets contaminated by salt water that comes rushing in with coastal flooding, it now jeopardizes the water supply.
You can't drink it because it's too salty.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the big pulls for these regions is the coral, people diving, looking at coral reefs, but they're not just beautiful and for tourists, they play a massive, massive part in the ecosystem. What's happening with them in terms of the changing climate?
Well, you're quite right about the role that coral reefs play in the ecosystem and in the livelihoods of island people. The coral reefs provide nursing grounds for fish, and those supply food as well as livelihoods for fisher folk. With climate change, we've had more marine heat waves. So think of heat waves that you have on the ground, but think of them in the water. The water gets warm and gets way too hot as well, and that leads to coral bleaching. The fish basically migrate away from these areas when it's too hot, and so we have decreased fish, lower quality fish. And coral reefs play an important role as well in protecting coastlines. So a lot of that coastal flooding and those large coastal waves that can lead to flooding, they themselves can be broken up by coral reefs. But corals can't provide that protection when they've been bleached. It's not, or that protection is not as good as it would have been if they were not bleached.
Those are all of the problems that many small island nations are facing. What can they do to change? What can they do? We call it adaptation. How can they change to deal with this damage?
So adaptation has three levers that it works on. So it can work on the climate hazard. That's the amount of water that's coming in. Small islands like to rely on nature-based solutions like coral reefs and like mangroves to help reduce that amount of water or the strength of the waves that are coming in. The other option that the other lever that adaptation operates on is on exposure. So what you would do is get people out of harm's way. That can look like literally lifting people up. So we have a lot of elevated houses on the coast, more stringent regulations about what can be built on coastlines and where it can be built. And another aspect is reducing the vulnerability. That's the third lever. And that is where finance comes in. For countries to be able to respond, they need to have robust finance systems to pay for these measures. And the truth is that small islands simply don't have those funds.
I want to come to cost in a minute, but I just want to get some really practical examples of these different types of adaptation. So you mentioned mangroves, and I've also seen that grass can be used as well.
Yes, yes. There's a type of grass called a vetiver grass. We use it in the Caribbean, and it's also being used in Fiji in an interesting project where they're doing what's called a nature-based seawall. And that one is made of a grass, this vetiver grass, that has a very strong root system that holds together soil and rock. And so this nature-based seawall is a combination of rocks, mangroves, and this grass to create a green living kind of seawall that is meant to reduce the flooding.
And then what about the more traditional kind of concrete and engineering solutions that different islands are trying?
Well, certainly those are well known. So I think we've heard the terms levees and seawalls quite a bit when talking about coastal flooding. And those do work very well in reducing water coming inland when they are built high enough for the height of the waves or the amount of storm surge that is coming in.
Well, the other part that you're talking about that I hadn't really thought of was drinking water. What can islands do to protect the most precious resource of drinking water for people and tourists that are there?
So some islands already rely on desalination,
So
and that
that's
is
taking salt out of the water?
exactly that. So that's what the word hints at. The D is to tell you to take out, and the salination part is the salt. So there are several desalination plants that are built sometimes near the coast to remove or that take some of the salty water that is already on land. And that water is not as salty as if you were in the ocean. So this is water that's, let's say, at a river that's kind of emptying out into the sea. That water is not as salty as ocean water, and you can filter the salt out or treat the water in a certain way to extract the salt from it. And islands have been doing that. And the way that they've tried to protect their desalination plants is to either move them inland, where that salt water doesn't get as far upstream, or they make the big shift and say, well, I'm going to have to deal with salty water anyway, because the water is pushing in from the sea and also pushing up from underneath. And so some islands are making big shifts to build offshore desalination plants. These are even more expensive as the technology needs to be much more robust to deal with much saltier water, much more corrosive environments, really, really difficult engineering situations.
Can you give me a rundown of the costs of the different solutions?
Yes, so as I mentioned, things like seawalls and levees, when they're done in the traditional ways, they can cost $6 million US to 20 million US per kilometer of seawall that needs to be built. Nature-based solutions are generally much cheaper, or less expensive. So that living seawall that I described from Fiji, that project is valued at about 5 million, and it's estimated to protect 12 communities. And so it is a really interesting project at looking at using much less expensive technologies and those that can be grown and utilized much more readily in these environments because they are naturally from there. The mangroves already grow there. The vetiver grass already grows there. And so they're using resources that are already there, and that helps to keep the costs down.
One thing that struck me, Roseanne, was that we're often talking about the Pacific and places that are quite remote and many people won't have been to. But what many people will be in is a city on the coast right now. Billions of us live on the coast. Are the things that are being tried out on the different islands, are they one day actually going to help protect Miami, Mumbai, Lagos, Liverpool? Are they actually the front line both of climate change and of how we'll have to adapt other cities?
Yes, definitely. So the Caribbean was actually the first region in the world to implement a catastrophic risk insurance facility. And so that pulls together the risks and the costs for bearing those risks across several islands. And that kind of scheme has not been tried in the world. And it was to address the damages from climate change. And so these kind of schemes have now been implemented in other places. In terms of protecting freshwater systems, a lot of these schemes about looking at desalination plants and relocating them, Those have first been tried in small islands, but have now been expanded into places like Miami, where they are also worried about the treatment of their water supply and the threats to their water supply from salt water pushing inland and upward from underneath.
So while we talk about, the 65 million people on the small islands or thereabouts, actually what's happening there will affect billions of people.
That's right. The UN Secretary General's office put out a report on sea level rise last year and noted that while the small islands are at the front lines, there are a number of coastal cities, Tokyo, Liverpool, Miami, etc., that will be impacted and that need to pay attention. Their countries need to pay attention and reduce emissions now to protect their own citizens.
Thank you, Roseanne. Really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to Tina Steggy, the climate envoy for the Marshall Islands. Hi, Tina.
Hello again.
Tina, we heard there Roseanne talking about protecting drinking water, planting grasses and different infrastructure changes. What have you been doing in the Marshall Islands or planning to do to try and adapt?
So 2 years ago in 2023, we actually published our National Adaptation Plan, which was something that we had worked on for 5 years. One of the things that we identified as sort of early intervention was around identifying good nature-based solutions that would work in an atoll environment, because those are a bit less expensive, hopefully can utilize the resources that we have in place already. We are also looking at hard infrastructure solutions that were mentioned, things like seawalls. And in fact, there's a project that's ongoing now in Ebi, which is one of our largest communities. We've seen, even as we do that, the real challenges, because for us, we're so remote, we're out in the middle of the Pacific, and it's the materials that are really difficult for us. We don't have many of the materials locally that are needed for construction. And so these have to be shipped in. And of course, that raises costs exponentially. So but it's something that we do have to be looking at. And then even further down the line, we have to even consider potentially, raising land. So not just raising the physical infrastructure so that people are safer because homes are off the ground, et cetera, but identifying the most resilient pieces of land that we have or atolls that we have, and potentially raising land so that people can stay on those atolls.
I mean, you're talking about a fight for survival, and these are small nations and small economies, and that fight costs money. How can these vulnerable islands access funding to carry out all this adaptation?
Yes, that's it's an enormous challenge that we're facing. Even for 2 of our urban atolls, the costs that have been identified just for the hard infrastructure alone, we're talking, around we've been quoted $9 billion. And that is just, orders of magnitude beyond what we can generate at home. And even the capacity to do much of this work is something that is a constraint for the Marshall Islands, but also a constraint for all small island states. And so we're talking a lot with partners and at the global level about how structures will need to change for us to be able to even absorb the help that we need. So those are some of the conversations we're having. It is an enormous challenge, but we are just chipping away every day. And there's a lot of work that's happening now. So much more that we need to do, but there is really a lot happening on the ground in the Marshall Islands.
If we don't reduce our emissions fast enough, if we can't hold that warming to a level beneath 1.5 degrees that keeps coming up at the climate conferences, your adaptation plan has resettlement in it. I mean, the idea that you might have to just move people altogether from the Marshall Islands.
Again, it's sort of the last ditch solution. It's not one that anyone wants, but we looked at all the scenarios, and including the worst case scenarios, which is that, we have sea level rise that just goes beyond our ability to adapt, and what we need to do in that case. And yes, resettlement out of the country is discussed.
I mean, we've talked about small island nations, small island developing states. We've talked about infrastructure, but really what we're talking about is home. And for everyone listening, they will understand how important home is to them. It's so much more than roads and airports and so on. And I'm wondering, how do you keep the culture of the Marshall Islands through all of these changes? How do you keep that sort of essence of what home is for people there?
For us, being on our land, in our land, is an anchor. And even with all the changes that people are experiencing, that anchor is still quite strong. We have a very strong, what we call land tenure system it's matrilineal. It ties us to each other and to very specific parcels of land through our mothers, right? And so it's the basis of a clan system that, is basically operates as a social safety net before you ever had anything put together by a government. These are all very much still in place and still operating in the Marshalls. And as long as we're able to stay on our lands, they will continue to operate. If we had to leave, it would completely change that whole way of thinking, way of being. You can preserve things in museums. You can write stories down. You can share things now through technology, online. You can create connections, perhaps that didn't exist before. But these are different. They're fundamentally different in the way that they exist, and therefore the way you exist as a being. What being Marshallese means will probably change if we have to leave the Marshall Islands, which is why we're fighting every day to ensure that we can stay.
Tina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's it for this episode of The Climate Question from the BBC World Service. Make sure you subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode. And if you've a question or a comment you'd like to give us, you can reach us at theclimatequestion@bbc.com.